You wake up to the sound of church bells, not for prayer, but for death. The air is thick, not just with the stench of rot, but with something worse. Fear. It seeps through the cobblestone streets, clings to the walls, and settles in every heartbeat. Outside your door, carts roll by, piled with bodies wrapped in rags. Someone whispers, "Bring out your dead." You pull the blanket over your face, praying the smell won't reach you, praying it won't reach you. But the cough in your throat betrays you. It's 1348. The year the world started to end. People say it came from rats, from sailors, from God's wrath itself. They wear beaked masks, stuffed with herbs, they burn incense, they carve crosses into their doors, anything to stay sane while death knocks on every window. But behind the superstition lies something darker, how society fractured, how faith twisted, and how madness spread faster than the plague itself. This isn't just history. This is what it felt like to live through humanity's darkest hours, where every breath could be your last. Welcome to Inside the Black Plague, how people lived, died, and tried to stay sane. And tonight, you're not just watching the story, you're in it. The change came slowly at first, so slow that few noticed. The mornings lost their crispness, the air grew thick, and the scent that once carried wood smoke and bread began to sour. It was not decay exactly, but something older, something wrong. In the narrow lanes between houses, damp clung to the stone like skin to bone. The sky turned the color of pewter, and people spoke less, as if their words might carry the heaviness further. The birds, once riotous in spring, sang shorter songs, their voices fading before the echoes could return. By dusk, the city smelled of something that had no name. It gathered near the wells, near the gutters, in the folds of clothing hung to dry. Housewives wrung their linens twice, convinced the odor came from mildew, but it was thicker than that, more like breath from something vast and unseen. The old said the wind had turned against them. The young said the sea was sick, but no one wanted to believe that the air itself, the one thing that touched them all, might be carrying death. Inside the taverns, men drank with their backs to the door. Conversations faltered when a stranger coughed, when a rat skittered across the floor. Even the hearth fires seemed to burn differently, less orange, more smoke than flame. Somewhere near the docks, a shipment from the east had arrived, its crew pale and silent, their eyes filmed with exhaustion. The merchants spoke of a fever that had burned through Constantinople, a strange swelling of the flesh, a death that came faster than prayer. No one believed them. Not yet. Nights were the worst. The air grew still, thick as wool, and the stars above blurred behind a haze no wind could scatter. Dogs howled without reason. Candles guttered as if sighing. In the poorer districts, people began to sleep outdoors, hoping the open sky might spare them what the walls concealed. Mothers pressed damp cloths to their children's faces, whispering charms against the sickness they couldn't name. The bells rang too often, and each ring seemed closer than the last. Then came the silence. It began in the marketplace, where the shouting of vendors dwindled to murmurs, and then to nothing. Carts stood half unloaded, apples rotting in the sun. Pigeons walked freely between stalls where once there had been crowds. A baker's wife swore she could taste iron in the wind. A priest fainted during Mass. By sundown, every window was closed, every latch drawn. The city held its breath. And in that pause, long, uneasy, absolute, the world seemed to lean toward something it did not yet understand. The first rat squealed from under a crate, then another, then 100, rushing toward the alleys as though fleeing a fire no one else could see. Behind them, scent thickened, metallic and wet. When dawn returned, the air no longer smelled of bread or river water. It smelled of endings, and no one, not even the priests or the physicians, dared step outside to ask why. They came gliding out of the fog merchant ships from the east, their sails slack and stained, their hulls brushing the tide with an uneasy quiet. From the harbour wall, the dockworkers saw no movement on deck, no voices calling to shore. The flags of Genoa and Messina hung limp in the windless dawn, and the gulls that usually circled the masts kept their distance, wheeling wide as though the air above the vessels were cursed. At first, no one thought to fear. The harbour master sent word to prepare the cranes and tallymen, to unload the goods that might fetch coin before the summer rains. But when the first men boarded, the silence met them like a wall. Crates lay split open, ropes tangled, barrels half-rolled as if dropped mid-task. A deckhand found a sailor face down beside the mainmast, skin the colour of wax, his hands curled like a child's. Another was discovered in the galley, his head resting on the table, untouched food before him. No blood, no wounds, just stillness. The ship's log was soaked through, the ink smeared beyond reading. One man claimed to see the word fever scrawled between the stains, but the others said it was imagination. They carried the bodies to shore and covered them with canvas, muttering that some illness of the sea must have taken them. But as they worked, a sailor among the living began to cough a dry, hollow sound that drew no breath back in. By dusk, his skin had flushed and his eyes had gone glassy. The townsfolk gathered along the pier, whispering behind their hands. A few brave women stepped forward to trade for silk and spice, insisting that the dead had been weak, that such things happened after long voyages. The traders who unloaded the cargo did so in haste, their faces wrapped in cloth. No one spoke of fear, though it clung to them heavier than the mist. That night, torches burned by the waterfront until dawn, as if light could hold back what the wind carried inland. Within days, more ships arrived, Venetian, Ragusan, Pisan, each telling the same silent story. Their crews were skeletons of the living, their decks slick with decay. The port physician refused to climb aboard, claiming divine wrath was at work. The fishermen tied rags around their mouths and rowed in circles far from shore, praying the current would not turn toward them. The city council met in the cathedral under the sound of distant coughing. They argued over trade, over faith, over how many coffins the carpenters could make in a week. But by then, the decision had already been made by the tide itself. The wind blew from the harbour toward the heart of the city, carrying with it the scent of salt and rot and something invisible, smaller than dust, more patient than sin. When dawn came, the ships still floated in the bay, their sails unmoving, their decks crowded only by the circling of black wings. The bells began to ring, one by one, across the sleeping town, and the sea, which had always given life, had begun to give it back dead. By the time the ships were burned in the harbour, it was already too late. The sickness had walked inland quietly, invisibly carried in the breath of those who had stood too close, in the wool of the traders, in the grain sacks stacked in the wagons. The market square, once the loudest place in the city, began to fall strangely silent. The air there had always smelled of spice, sweat, and roasting meat. Now it carried the faint sweetness of rot. On market mornings, fewer stalls opened. The old women who sold herbs stayed home, saying their joints ached from the damp, though everyone knew what they feared. The fishmongers laid out their catch behind cloths tied across their faces, and when someone coughed, even lightly, the sound turned heads like the crack of a whip. Buyers hurried their bargains, dropped coins without counting them, and left with hands held out from their sides as though touching anything might invite death. It was then that the first whisper spread that the sickness had no cure, that it came through the air itself. Some said it was punishment, others blamed the foreign sailors or the wells or the stars. But what people feared most wasn't what they knew, it was what they didn't. The invisible thing that might be hiding in the next breath. The baker's boy, who once shouted jokes across the square, now kept his mouth closed tight, eyes down, as he passed the stalls. Even the beggars had vanished from the church steps. The city guards began marking doors with chalk, a pale cross for those who had fallen ill, a darker one for those already gone. At first, there were only a few. By the week's end, every street leading into the market had them. The bells tolled each morning for the dead, but soon they tolled simply to remind the living that they were still alive. And yet, life clung on in small ways. A fruit seller, her face lined with years, still polished apples no one would buy. A musician played his flute from the shadow of an empty fountain, though no coins fell into his cup. Across the square, a young woman stood waiting at her stall of candles, rows of soft white wax gleaming in the dim light. People said she made them for the funerals, for the prayers, for the nights when the wind howled too loud, but when asked why she stayed, she only said, "Someone must bring light." At dusk, when the last carts rolled away and the square emptied, the sound of the city changed. It was quieter now, almost tender. The creak of wooden wheels, the slow clap of shutters closing, the single flutter of wings above the roofs. Then nothing, only the faint hiss of the wind between the stones. The market slept, but beneath the cobbles, in the burrows of the rats, the real trade had already begun, one of flesh and fever, swift and unseen, moving from house to house until every street in the city held its share of silence. The bells had always been a comfort. Their voices drifted over rooftops with the dawn, calling bakers to their ovens and farmers to their fields. But now, their chime meant something else. They rang for the sick, for the dead, for the ones who wouldn't wake when morning came. The sound no longer rose clean and bright, it dragged, heavy, as though the metal itself had grown tired of mourning. Beneath that toll, another sound began to grow, the soft rustle of carts, the shuffle of feet, the coughs that no one dared name aloud. It was the smell, though, that came first. A scent too thick for the air to carry cleanly. It crept into the church from the graveyard beyond the walls, sliding through the cracks in the stone. At first, the priests blamed the heat, saying the summer had turned sour. But when the altar boys fainted during Mass and candles burned low before their time, they knew something had changed. The incense could no longer hide it. Frankincense, myrrh, lavender, all were swallowed by the same sweet, corrupted perfume that clung to everything it touched. Outside, the grave diggers worked through the night. The earth was too full, too hard, and too wet. Men who once carved marble or hauled wine now dug holes for strangers. The spade struck stone, then flesh, then stone again. The smell followed them home, no matter how much they washed. In the mornings, their wives hung herbs from the rafters and burned sage at the doors. But the air was greedy. It ate through the herbs, through the walls, through every prayer whispered into the dark. By midday, the churchyard swelled. Crosses leaned against one another, crooked and hurried. The priests stopped writing names. There were too many to remember. Instead, they carried their books open but unwritten, reciting the same blessing over each mound. From dust to dust, they said, again and again, until the words themselves lost meaning. And above it all, the bells kept tolling, steady as a heartbeat. Inside, the cathedral, the choir still sang. Voices rose into the rafters, high and fragile, like light breaking through fog. But those who came to listen found no comfort. The music only made the silence between the notes more unbearable. One woman, kneeling at the altar, swore she saw smoke rising from the chalice. Another said she heard whispering from beneath the pews. The priests told them it was grief, nothing more. Yet when they turned away, their own hands trembled. At dusk, the last bell of the day rang out. The sound rolled through the city like thunder, echoing off the empty streets. Windows shut, doors bolted. In the stillness that followed, the air seemed to shift heavier, closer, alive. Somewhere in the distance, another bell began to answer, then another, and another, until the whole horizon seemed to ring with morning. And beneath those bells, in the hollow between sound and silence, the city began to decay quietly, completely, like fruit, softening in its own skin. At first, they were ignored. Just another nuisance in a city already unraveling. The rats had always been there, slipping through cracks, nesting in the hay, gnawing at grain sacks when no one watched. But now they grew bold. They darted across doorsteps at noon, their bellies swollen, their eyes glinting red in the torchlight. The cats that used to hunt them vanished, one by one, as if they too could smell what was coming. And beneath the floorboards, At night came the sound, a restless scratching that never stopped. The children heard it first. They whispered to their mothers that something lived in the walls, that it breathed and chewed and laughed when the wind blew. The mothers shushed them, pulled the blankets tighter, but they heard it too, a constant rustling that traveled from cellar to cellar, like whispers being passed through stone. The bakers complained that their flour spoiled faster than before, crawling with black specks. The innkeepers found droppings in their kitchens. The monks who kept the granaries began burning their stores, saying the grain was cursed. In the evenings, when the streets emptied and the last bell of vespers faded, the rats came out in armies. They poured from the drains and gutters, moving as one dark river of fur and teeth. They swarmed the market stalls, the stables, the graves. Some said they saw them drinking from the puddles near the burial pits, their whiskers glistening red. By morning, the cobblestones were slick with what they left behind. People began to whisper that the rats were not animals at all, but messengers, that they were carrying something the wind could not. The old women crossed themselves when they saw one, muttering charms from their childhood. The young men threw stones and cursed them, but for every rat they killed, 3 more seemed to take its place. It was as if the city itself was birthing them, from the rot beneath its own foundations. In the poorer quarters, the scratching turned to gnawing. Doors were chewed through overnight, bread vanished from shelves, and sometimes, when a baby's cry went unheard too long, only the blanket remained. People began sleeping on tables or rooftops, hoping height would keep them safe. It didn't. The rats climbed everything. Their claws could find purchase in brick, in timber, even in flesh. Then came the fleas. Tiny, invisible, merciless. They rode on the rats' backs and into the beds of the living. The scratching spread from walls to skin. Men woke with red sores beneath their arms. Women fainted from fevers that burned without warning. The physicians said it was bad air, the alignment of stars, divine punishment. But the people began to understand something the scholars would not say aloud, that death had learned to crawl. By the time the city noticed, it was already infested, not with vermin, but with fate. The rats had come as heralds, and behind their endless scratching in the walls, something darker was beginning to move. It began like exhaustion, a heaviness behind the eyelids, a warmth that refused to fade. Men blamed it on the long hours, the bad air, the summer's closeness. Women said it was nerves, too much sorrow weighing on the heart. But by morning, the warmth had turned to heat, and the eyes of the afflicted shone with a brightness that did not belong to the living. The fever took hold like a hand pressing from within, and soon no water nor prayer could cool it. The first to fall were the dock workers who had handled the ships, their skin flushed and slick. They wandered through the streets in confusion, speaking to people who weren't there, their steps faltering like drunkards. When they tried to eat, they could not swallow. When they tried to sleep, they moaned until dawn. Those who saw them said the eyes were the worst, red-rimmed, glassy, filled with something that looked too much like knowing, as if they could already see the end that awaited them. In the houses along the river, mothers began to notice the same glow in their children, a fever that came like fire and left the skin cold as marble. They carried them to the priests, to the herbalists, to anyone who would listen, but no one dared touch them. The healers handed out potions of vinegar and ash, powders of crushed roses, charms wrapped in linen. Nothing worked. The sickness burned clean through it all, relentless, silent, without mercy. By the second week, the city stank of sweat and smoke. Every window was shuttered, every street strangely still. Inside the houses, the fevers multiplied. The sick began to mutter strange things, snatches of prayer, fragments of memory, words that made no sense. Some begged to be bled, believing the devil had taken residence in their veins. Others clawed at their own eyes, trying to let the heat escape. The midwives and barbers worked until their arms gave out, their aprons soaked dark with the blood of those who wouldn't survive the night. The worst was the silence that followed. One by one, the voices faded, leaving behind only the sound of slow breathing, and the creak of the boards beneath the dying. Those who still had strength sat by the windows, staring out as though watching for a sign, a wind, a light, anything to show that it would pass. But the air did not move. The streets lay empty, thick with the smell of sickness. By nightfall, a strange glow could be seen from the upper towers, lanterns flickering behind windows, as if the whole city were burning from the inside. The fever had found its rhythm now, pulsing through the streets like a heartbeat. Every house was a chamber of heat and whispers. Every soul that burned fed the fire further. And somewhere in that breathless heat, beneath the sweat and prayer and trembling, the first buboes began to rise, dark, round, and full of what the fever had left behind. They called them God's flowers at first, dark petals rising beneath the skin, blooming where no light could reach. The swellings appeared without warning, small as coins at first, then growing, throbbing, ripening like fruit left too long in the sun. They came beneath the arms, along the neck, between the thighs, places the body tried to keep secret, and when they broke, the air filled with a sweetness that turned the stomach. No one could watch another suffer without imagining it upon their own flesh. Women who once dressed the wounds of their husbands now trembled to touch them. Mothers turned away from their sons. The physicians, masked in leather and oil, came with their long sticks to prod the swellings, to lance them when the pressure grew unbearable. The victims screamed and called for mercy, but the doctor's eyes were hidden behind glass, their words muffled through the beak. They worked without comfort, for comfort had become a luxury of the uninfected. In the poorer quarters, the streets ran black. Rags, soaked in vinegar, hung from doorways. People prayed into basins of water, staring at their reflections as if expecting to see the sickness forming beneath their skin. The black blossoms had become a sign, a sentence. Once they bloomed, no one expected to live another sunrise. The priests no longer came to bless the dying. Even the grave diggers stood back. It was said that the smell could mark a man for death as surely as touch. At night, those still living listened for the moans that rose from the houses around them. The sound was soft, rhythmic, almost tender, a lullaby of suffering that spread from window to window. Dogs howled, infants wailed until their voices gave out. Then, at last, silence would fall, and another house would be marked with chalk. The flowers did not choose by rank or faith. Nobles fell as quickly as beggars. Monks who had sworn chastity died beside thieves who had never known a prayer. The pestilence recognized the difference between silk and rags, between king and peasant. It moved through the air with the same grace as a sigh, and as the buboes burst, spreading their black blood into the earth, it seemed as though the very soil was learning to breathe the sickness back. Those who survived a few days longer bore scars where the swellings had opened, blackened rings that never fully faded. They carried them like brands, proof that death had passed them by, at least for now. Some claimed to hear whispers in the night, voices of the ones who hadn't made it, calling them back. Others felt nothing at all, just emptiness. By the time the bells tolled again, half the city had bloomed. The streets looked as if the earth itself had grown sores, dark shapes beneath every shutter, every sheet, every mound of dirt. The flowers of the plague had come into full season, and their harvest was only beginning. Once, their voices were the first sound a newborn heard, a firm command, a whispered prayer, the rhythm of life continuing. But now, the midwives moved like ghosts through the city, their hands trembling, their cloths soaked not with birth but with fever. They no longer answered calls in the night. The cries of laboring women echoed unanswered down the alleys, and even the bravest of them began to deliver their own children in the shadows, their screams swallowed by the hum of flies at the windows. No one trusted breath anymore. The air itself felt unclean. The midwives had always been the keepers of life, the bridge between the living and what waited beyond. But the bridge had rotted. One by one, they began to vanish, some taken by the sickness, others by despair. Their houses stood dark, their herbs hanging brittle above cold hearths. The tools of their trade, linen, water basins, oil gathered dust while outside. The bells kept tolling, louder each day. Those who still dared to answer the door came wrapped in layers of wool and vinegar-soaked cloth. They spoke little. Their eyes were red from smoke and sleeplessness. They said they could smell death before it arrived, the faint iron scent that clung to the mothers before the first contraction. They would work in silence, deliver the child, and leave without blessing or farewell. The babies rarely cried. Many didn't live long enough to. The survivors said it was as though the city itself had grown barren. The laughter of infants, once a common sound, had disappeared. Instead, the wind carried a different kind of wailing, the keening of widows, the coughing of the dying, the rattle of cartwheels over cobblestones. In some quarters, it was said no child had been born for weeks. The midwives called it the closing of the womb, as though creation itself had turned its face away. There were stories of one who refused to stop, an old woman named Marta, whose back was bent but whose will had never broken. She walked through the empty lanes at night, lantern in hand, answering calls no one else dared. They said she hummed hymns as she worked, though her voice cracked with every breath. She washed the newborns in wine, wrapped them in torn altar cloths, and whispered their names as blessings. Some lived, most did not. When Marta herself fell ill, she asked to be buried beside the river, where the water still runs, she said, and something remembers to move. After her death, even the boldest women stopped trying. They sealed their doors, tended only to their own, and the city grew quieter still. The birth cry, that bright thread that once wove through every morning, had been cut. In its place came only the sound of the wind slipping through the shutters, low and mournful, like the memory of a voice that no longer dared to speak. Life, for the first time anyone could remember, had forgotten how to begin. The ovens went cold first. The bakers stopped rising before dawn, their fires unlit, their stones grey. Flour lay in sacks untouched, crawling with weevils. The smell of bread, a scent that had once wrapped the whole city in comfort, vanished overnight. It was replaced by something sharper, hungrier, the scent of emptiness itself. Those who still had coin stood in line before shuttered shops, clutching baskets like relics, waiting for loaves that would never come. Hunger crept slower than the plague, but it was just as cruel. The merchants stopped trading when the carts stopped coming. The millers were dead, the fields untended, and the granaries locked tight behind city guards who had long since fled. The poor scoured the alleys for crumbs, tearing at mouldy crusts left behind by the sick. Mothers boiled bark and weeds into thin soups, feeding their children lies of tomorrow. The rich hoarded what little grain remained, and for a time their feasts glowed bright behind closed windows. But soon even their candles began to gutter. The famine was its own contagion. Starvation hollowed the eyes of those who had already survived the fever. People began to fight over scraps, over the heel of a loaf, over a dead rat pulled from a trap. The market square, once a place of barter and laughter, turned into a graveyard of stalls. The wood rotted, the barrels broke, and beneath the awnings, families slept, too weak to beg, too tired to bury their own. By the second month, there were rumors of bread baked from ground bones, of broth thickened with things better left unnamed. The priests preached moderation and faith, but their own faces grew gaunt. They said it was God's test to endure hunger and keep one's soul clean. But the people had begun to question what good a soul was when the body could no longer stand. The bakers who remained alive refused to bake for money. They baked for mercy, for prayers, for protection from neighbors who would kill for a single loaf. One man named Leon was said to have stayed at his oven even when his family fell ill. He kept baking until the last of the flour was gone, handing bread to anyone who knocked. When they found him days later, the loaves were still warm beside him. The neighbors called them blessed, though none dared eat them at first. And so hunger joined death in its quiet work. The streets grew thinner, emptier. The sound of the bell faded, not because it stopped ringing, but because there were fewer ears left to hear it. By the time autumn came, the air had turned sharp again. The river was low, the fields pale. and for a brief moment, when the wind blew from the west, it carried something faint and distant, a memory of bread baking somewhere far away, in a town still living, still unaware that the hunger was coming for them next. For a time, the priests had been the bravest among them. They walked through the alleys with their hoods drawn, knocking on doors no one else dared approach. They carried crucifixes and incense, muttering the words of absolution through cracks in the wood. The dying called for them at night, voices trembling, asking for confession, for the comfort of holy touch. And for a while, they came. They anointed foreheads slick with fever, lifted the dying in their arms, whispered Pater Noster into ears already deafening with the nearness of death. But courage has a limit, even for the devout. The first priest to fall was Father Thomas, a man known for his booming laughter. He went from house to house until one morning he didn't rise for Mass. By evening, his body was taken to the churchyard and buried in haste, his robe still wet from the anointing oils he had used that very day. The bells tolled for him as they had for all the others, but the sound seemed thinner somehow, as though faith itself were faltering. After that, the doors of the rectory stayed shut longer each morning. The priests prayed behind barred windows, their voices muffled by stone. Parishioners still came, knocking, pleading for blessings through the iron grates, holding up swaddled infants, or clutching the hands of the fevered. Some priests would lift the chalice through the bars, let the light strike it, and tell the people it was enough that God could see through distance. Others refused to answer at all. By midsummer, the churchyards were overflowing. The clergy could no longer keep pace with the dead. Bodies were stacked 3 deep in the chapels, the air thick with wax, incense, and decay. The priests stopped using holy water, it was too precious, and began sprinkling ashes instead. They told the living that ashes were closer to truth, and when their own brothers fell sick, they buried them in silence, reciting no rites, saving their breath for prayers that might yet be heard. Rumors began to spread that the priests had lost faith, that God himself had turned away. Some said the church doors were sealed not to keep death out, but to keep something worse within. Others whispered of visions seen by the monks at night, figures moving through the nave, candles flaring without flame. The priests denied it, but they no longer walked the streets. One night, an old woman came to the cathedral steps carrying her dying grandson. She pounded on the doors until her hands bled, begging for the sacrament. No one answered. When dawn came, both she and the boy were still there, slumped together in silence. The townsfolk buried them at the threshold, saying it was the holiest ground left. By autumn, the bells had changed their sound. They no longer called the faithful to prayer, they marked the absence of it. And as their toll echoed across the empty streets, the people began to wonder whether the priests had stopped knocking, or whether there was simply no one left to answer. They tolled from morning until night, a slow dirge that rolled through the air like mist over the river. Once, the bells had been the city's heartbeat, summoning workers, marking the hours, celebrating marriages and births. Now, they spoke only of endings. Their tolls merged with the wind, so constant and unrelenting that silence itself began to feel like a miracle. No one knew who still rang them. The bell towers had become lonely places, haunted perches above streets that no longer breathed. Some said it was the monks, those who had not yet fled, their hands blistered from the rope. Others believed the ropes pulled themselves, moved by the weight of so many souls. On certain nights, when the fog thickened and the moon was gone, people swore the bells rang without pattern or rhythm, like cries echoing from the clouds. The children had learned to count the tolls the way they once counted games. 1 ring for a neighbor, 2 for a family, 10 for a street. The numbers grew until they stopped bothering to keep track. In time, the bells became background noise, woven into the air like the smell of smoke. The living worked and ate and buried their dead to its rhythm, numb to its meaning. Each district had its own sound. In the poorer wards, the bells were cracked, their voices raw, scraping against the sky. In the higher quarters, they rang clean and clear, almost beautiful music for the dead dressed in linen and silver. The sound drifted down to the lower streets. where the poor paused for just a moment, listening to the purity of it, wondering if heaven sounded the same. One afternoon, a strong wind swept across the city. It carried the toll of every bell at once, a great metallic storm that rolled through the valleys and over the rooftops. The people froze where they stood, the horses reared, birds scattered, and for a few impossible moments, it felt as though the earth itself was mourning. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. The air felt hollow, stripped of heartbeat. People crept from their doors, their eyes lifted to the towers. The ropes hung still, swaying in the wind. No monk descended the steps. No figure was seen on the ladders. It was as if the last of the faithful had vanished into the sky. That night, the silence broke again. A single bell, distant, slow, rang once every few minutes, an echo stretched thin across the dark. It tolled without pause until dawn. No one knew which tower it came from. Some said it was rung by the dead themselves, marking their passage as they crossed unseen from the city into whatever waited beyond. From that day forward, no one looked to the towers. The sound had ceased to belong to the living. The bells no longer spoke of warning, nor of mercy. They had become the voice of the plague itself, tolling on long after every human hand had stilled. It began with flinching, a simple hesitation when a friend reached out, when a child tugged at a mother's sleeve, when coins passed from hand to hand. What once was human instinct, the comfort of nearness, became unbearable. Touch had turned treacherous. A single brush of skin could mean death within days. The sickness moved invisibly, but everyone imagined it clinging to fingertips, sleeping in fabric, waiting in the warmth of another's palm. Lovers who once walked arm in arm now trailed each other at a distance. Families shared rooms but not embraces. In the taverns, mugs were left half full because no one dared drink after another. The city that had once thrived on closeness, markets crowded, churches full, began to shrink inward. Neighbors spoke through shutters, exchanging words instead of goods. They bowed instead of shaking hands. They nodded instead of holding the dying. There were stories of mothers who abandoned their children when the fever came, too afraid to lift them from their beds. Others went mad from guilt, washing their hands raw in vinegar and ashes. In one house, a woman tied a rope between herself and her sick husband so she could pray beside him without crossing the room. Each time he coughed, she pulled the rope tighter, as though the distance could hold off fate. By morning, the rope lay slack, and she cut it with shaking hands. The healers tried to ease the fear with rules: burn your clothes, cover your mouth, keep to the shadows when the wind blows, but nothing could tame the panic that lived in the body. The fear became its own contagion. People began to see death in every gesture: a hand on a shoulder, a kiss of comfort, a child clutching a toy once held by another. Even the dogs, sensing the change, learned not to nuzzle their master's legs. There were those who defied it, a few brave souls who still touched the dying out of duty or love. They called them the blessed fools. Old nuns who wiped the brows of strangers, men who carried their fathers to the grave barehanded. No one thanked them, for thanks would have required closeness. But when they disappeared, the city seemed emptier still. As the days stretched into weeks, people forgot the sound of laughter. It had always been born of touch, shoulders brushing, hands clapping, the warmth of shared breath. Without it, the world grew thin and cold. The air itself seemed to avoid human contact, curling away like smoke. One evening, a storm rolled in from the sea. The rain fell hard, washing the streets clean for the first time in months. For a few moments, people stepped outside, faces tilted upward, letting the water strike their skin. It was the first time in weeks they had felt anything unafraid. But when the thunder faded and the rain stopped, they retreated once more behind their doors. And in the darkness of those rooms, they realized the plague had not only stolen their lives, it had stolen their nearness. Humanity had learned to live without touch, and in doing so, it had forgotten how to feel alive. The fairs had always been the heartbeat of the year. When the snow melted and the first green buds appeared on the trees, banners would be raised across the market square, and the smell of roasted meat, ale, and violets filled the air. Merchants from the countryside brought cloth and grain. Children chased ribbons through the crowd. The sound of fiddles and laughter echoed from morning till dusk. But that spring, the laughter never came. The banners still hung, faded and motionless, above an emptiness no one dared to name. The mayor had ordered the fair to continue. He said trade would drive out fear, that the city must keep moving lest it die. So the booths were built, the wagons rolled in, and the stalls stood open to the sun. Yet no one came. A few cautious souls wandered the aisles, their faces covered, their gloved hands tucked into their sleeves. They didn't haggle, didn't speak, only left coins on the tables and took what they needed. Even the air seemed to move slower there, as though it too were holding its breath. At the edge of the square, a puppet show began for an audience of 3. The puppeteer's voice cracked as he forced cheer into his words, his painted figures dancing to a tune no one clapped for. Beside him, a juggler tossed wooden balls into the air, missing every few throws but continuing anyway. Their persistence was heartbreaking, a performance for ghosts. The smells of the fair had changed too. Gone was the sweetness of sugar and roasted nuts. In its place came the scent of vinegar and smoke, of herbs burned to cleanse the air. Housewives carried bundles of rosemary, waving them before their faces. Merchants sprinkled wine over their goods, whispering prayers to ward away the pestilence. Still, everyone's eyes were restless, darting from one another's faces to the shadows beneath their own sleeves. By noon, the heat grew heavy. A faint buzzing rose from the edges of the square, where flies gathered near the cart of a butcher who hadn't shown since morning. People began to drift away, one by one, their silence louder than any music. The juggler stopped. The puppets hung limp. The fair died without a sound. When evening came, a wind swept through, tearing the ribbons from their posts. They tangled in the empty stalls, fluttering like the flags of a fallen army. The last few candles burned low, their wax melting into the dust. The mayor stood at the center of it all, staring at the desolation he had tried to deny. The fairground, once the living heart of the city, had become its wake. That night, rain fell. It washed the chalk from the cobblestones, the ash from the tables, and carried the last of the music down into the gutters. By dawn, only the echo of it remained, a faint hum in the wind, the memory of joy turning back into silence. It was the last fair anyone would ever speak of. After that spring, celebration became another word for mourning. When prayer failed, they turned to knives. The physicians, cloaked in black and heavy with confidence, declared that the body itself was poisoned, that salvation lay not in heaven, but in the draining of its own veins. Blood, they said, was where the rot began. So they sharpened their blades, heated their irons, and set to work on the dying and the desperate alike. The bloodletting chambers were small, candlelit rooms filled with whispers. The air was thick with the metallic scent of iron and fever. Patients sat on wooden stools, their sleeves rolled back, their skin pale and trembling. Some came willingly, believing that pain could trade places with death. Others were dragged in by family, their pleas ignored. The doctors moved with grim precision, pressing leeches to the flesh, waiting for them to swell black with stolen life before scraping them into bowls. The poor could not afford leeches, so they were bled by handcuffs heated with flame, then pressed to the skin until the blood rushed to meet them. The hiss of metal, the soft gasp, the dark flow into the basin, it all became its own kind of prayer. People said the room grew warmer after each bleeding, as though the fever itself had escaped into the air, but the patients did not recover. They left weaker, paler, trembling from blood loss. Some collapsed on the walk home, their faces ghostly white, lips blue. The physicians blamed the timing, the humidity, the stars, anything but the knife. And still, the people came. Hope, once anchored in faith, had found a new altar in pain. In one corner of the city, an apprentice named Silas began bleeding entire families at once. He moved from door to door, carrying his tools in a basket lined with rags. He promised relief, offered prayers, and took only bread in payment. At first, his name spread in whispers of gratitude, until the children he bled began to die faster than the rest. When the mothers accused him, he vanished into the night, leaving behind his knife, crusted dark with the proof of his work. Soon, the barbers and surgeons joined the practice. Their windows glowed through the fog like lanterns of false mercy. They hung jars of darkened blood in their stalls, convinced the sight of it would comfort others, proof that something was being done. But the jars grew in number, lining the shelves like trophies. Each one another soul bled in vain. Outside, the city continued to wither. The people spoke in hoarse voices, their veins traced blue beneath translucent skin. Some began to cut themselves in secret, thinking they might draw out the sickness before it reached the heart. And in the mornings, when the sunlight touched the cobblestones, it glinted faintly red drops that had dried in the night, tiny constellations of misplaced hope. The doctors called it progress, the dying called it surrender, and the streets, for the first time, began to smell of both blood and futility. The smell came first, sharp, medicinal, desperate. It clung to the air like guilt. Everywhere, people were burning something. Herbs, roots, rags soaked in vinegar. They said the plague floated in bad air, that if the air was made worse, smokier, thicker, it would frighten the sickness away. And so the city began to smolder. From morning until night, fires burned in the streets. Barrels filled with pitch and dung sent up dark clouds that rolled through the alleys, choking the breath from every living thing. Men tossed herbs into the flames, sage, rosemary, juniper, thyme, watching them hiss and curl into ash. Women hung bundles of lavender in the windows, believing the scent would trap death before it crossed the threshold. The wealthy carried pomanders filled with clove and ambergris, holding them to their noses like shields. The poor wrapped vinegar-soaked cloth around their faces and prayed the smoke would choose a richer victim. The wells, once clear and cool, had become places of fear. People said the sickness lurked there, coiled in the water, waiting for the thirsty. The priests declared the wells cursed, and so the townsfolk turned to fire instead. They built pyres beside the stone rims and burned herbs until the water shimmered black beneath the smoke. The air shimmered too thick with heat and superstition. Children coughed until their faces went red. The old men's eyes streamed with tears that burned. Yet no one dared stop. Every corner of the city burned. In the courtyards, people threw their clothes into the flames, convinced the cloth itself carried evil. Linen, silk, fur, all gone. The air filled with the stench of scorched hair and tallow. Smoke rose in pillars, twisting together into a ceiling of haze that dimmed the sun. By midday, the sky was a dull copper, and the shadows of buildings lay blurred as if seen through water. Still, the fires gave comfort. They made people feel powerful again, as if they were fighting something they could neither see nor understand. When the wind blew, it carried with it the illusion of cleansing, the thought that maybe the sickness could be smoked out like a rat. But the truth was cruel. The fires drove the rats deeper into the houses, into the basements, into the beds of the living. At night, the city glowed faintly red, like the embers of some dying forge. From the hills beyond the walls, travelers said it looked like a ghost of itself, a ring of fire circling a corpse. The smoke drifted out across the fields, settling into the soil, the wells, the river. The water tasted bitter for weeks afterward. By then, people had forgotten the smell of anything pure. Even the breeze carried traces of ash. When it rained, the drops came down grey, leaving streaks of soot on the stone. The city had tried to burn the plague away, but in doing so, it had turned itself into a single, slow-burning pyre. And in the morning, when the smoke lifted, the silence that followed felt almost clean until the coughing began again. When the sickness spread too fast for priests or healers, the city turned to the watchmen. They were not men of medicine or mercy, but of order. Their job was to guard the living from the dying, to keep the streets quiet, the doors sealed, and the fear contained behind walls. They patrolled after dusk, when the air grew thick and the smoke from the fires hung low over the rooftops. Each carried a long iron torch, its flame burning red against the dark. The people said you could tell where death had walked by the light of those torches flickering down the lanes. By decree, no house marked with the sign of sickness could open its door. The watchmen nailed the planks themselves crosswise, as if sealing a coffin. Inside, families whispered prayers by candlelight while the nails drove home. Some begged through the shutters for water, others for absolution. The watchmen gave neither. Their orders were to guard, not to save. They passed by with their torches and moved on to the next street, counting the living only by the sound of breathing through the cracks. Sometimes the silence was too much. The watchman would pause, listening for the faint cries from within, a mother calling for her child, a man praying into the dark. When the noises stopped, they marked the door again, this time with a circle of black pitch. It meant the house would need to be emptied by dawn. The dead had to be moved quickly before the air turned thick with their rot. The men who bore the torches began to change. Their faces grew grey from sleeplessness, their eyes hollow. Some drank before their rounds, others prayed. They said the flame was their protection, that as long as it burned, they would not fall ill. But fire has a way of consuming what it guards. Many watchmen vanished, their torches found gutted in the mud. Others went mad, claiming they could hear voices whispering from behind the sealed doors, calling their names, begging them to open. By night, the city became a maze of faint, red glows, dozens of torches moving in slow rhythm, smoke curling around their bearers like shrouds. The only other light came from the moon, pale and distant, like an indifferent witness. Behind every closed window, faces watched the watchmen pass, their hope and hatred intertwined. The people feared them, but they also depended on them. Without the torchlight, the darkness would have been unbearable. When the plague reached the hill districts, the watchmen were ordered to burn the houses rather than seal them. Fire was quicker, they said, more merciful. The flames devoured the infected and the innocent alike, but by morning the wind carried no stench from those streets, only ash. The officials called it purification. The survivors called it murder. Still, the torches burned on. Through the fog, through the cries, through the endless nights, they marked the border between the dying and the still living. And as the months passed, the men who carried them became something else, half human, half shadow, walking embodiments of the fire they feared to lose. Each dawn, when the last torch guttered out, the city seemed darker than before. The flames had kept the plague at bay, but they had also lit the path to something worse, a world where mercy no longer followed the light. At first, they came at dawn, when the fog still clung to the river and the bells were half asleep. A single cart, creaking along the cobblestones, drawn by a tired horse whose ribs showed through its hide. The driver wore a scarf across his face and called out softly as he passed, "Bring out your dead." The words echoed off the walls, swallowed by silence, answered only by the shuffling of feet as doors opened a crack and bodies were dragged to the street. By midsummer, the carts came day and night, no longer alone, but in grim procession, wooden wheels groaning under their burden, the stench trailing behind them like a banner. The men who drove them were paid in bread, sometimes in wine, and sometimes in nothing at all. They were the last profession left untouched by ruin, for death was the only business still thriving. They moved with the weary precision of ritual, lifting, stacking, covering, moving on. Their faces were pale in the torchlight, eyes red from smoke and sleep. No one wanted their work, yet everyone depended on it. Without the carts, the dead would rot in the streets. With them, the living were reminded of what waited behind every door. People began leaving the bodies out at night to avoid seeing them carried away. They laid them neatly on doorsteps or beneath the church walls, crossing their hands, tying small scraps of cloth around their wrists, so their loved ones might be recognized later in the pits. The sound of the carts became part of the city's rhythm, the steady roll of wheels, the dull thud of limbs, the faint ringing of a bell tied to the driver's wrist to warn others to stay clear. The children, what few were left, stopped playing. Dogs followed the carts for miles, whining, unwilling to let go of their masters. Sometimes a hand slipped from beneath the shroud, swinging with each bump in the road. Sometimes the eyes were still open. The cartmen spoke little, though they developed small habits to keep their minds intact. One sang, to himself in whispers, a lullaby he had heard his mother hum long ago. Another poured drops of wine onto the ground for each soul he carried, though he could no longer remember their number. A few made charms from the bones of the dead, convinced it would keep the sickness from touching them. None of it worked. Most did not live long enough to need their pay. By autumn, the streets had grown too narrow for the carts to pass. The bodies were stacked in alleys, in doorways, in wells. The drivers began burning them where they fell. The smoke from those fires was darker than any before, heavy, oily, thick with sorrow. From the hills, travelers said it looked as if the city were melting into itself. Still, the carts rolled on. They moved through the night like shadows, wheels squealing, hooves slipping in the mud. The sound became the lullaby of the dying world, a slow, endless rhythm that neither sleep nor dawn could silence. And when the last cart finally passed, its wheels leaving grooves in the earth, the streets felt impossibly empty, as if even death itself had grown tired of collecting. The priests no longer knew what to say. The holy books had not prepared them for this, and their voices had grown hoarse from blessing corpses instead of the living. What once had been scripture now felt hollow, words spoken to a God who no longer answered. The Psalms, those ancient songs of comfort, had been repeated until their meaning wore thin. "The Lord is my shepherd," they whispered, even as the flock lay rotting in the fields. The choirs had scattered long ago. Only a few monks remained, their chants echoing through half-empty cathedrals, bouncing off cold stone and dust. They sang because silence frightened them more than death, but even their voices trembled now, unsure of the rhythm, unsure if the heavens were still listening. The organ pipes were dry. The candles burned faster, the wax melting too soon, as if even the light was in a hurry to die. Each morning, the monks carried the dead from the nave to the graveyard, their robes soaked through with sweat and incense. They had stopped counting the bodies. The graves blurred into one another, crosses leaning like drunks in the rain. They still tried to speak the prayers, but the words tangled in their throats. Sometimes, mid-verse, a monk would stop and stare into the fog as if expecting the earth itself to answer back. People still came to the churches, though not to pray. They came to sit in the shadowed pews, to breathe the heavy scent of frankincense, to pretend for a moment that there was still something sacred left in the world. Mothers carried the bodies of their children to the altar, laying them before the crucifix and begging for a sign. The priests sprinkled ashes over them, murmured a final psalm, and walked away. There were no miracles anymore, only waiting. At night, the psalms turned into laments. The surviving clerics sang low, mournful tones that rose and fell like wind in a graveyard. Sometimes they sang for the dead, other times for themselves. In one abbey near the river, the abbot began writing new verses, strange and fevered, his ink shaking across the page. "We are the smoke of our own offering." The others burned the page before dawn, afraid of what it meant. Eventually, the bells fell silent, and the chants ceased. The last psalm was sung not in a church, but in a street by a lone friar carrying a wooden cross on his back. His voice was cracked and faint, his feet bleeding as he walked barefoot through the ash. He sang for no one, and for everyone, his words drifting into windows, into the rafters, into the mouths of those too weak to rise. "Deliver us," he whispered, "deliver us from this pestilence of silence." By the time he reached the city gates, his song had faded to a hum. The wind caught it and carried it east, over the fields, over the graves, over a land that no longer believed in music. And when it vanished, so did the last echo of faith. The psalms were gone, and the world had forgotten how to pray. The churches stood open, but no one entered. Their doors gaped like mouths left open in disbelief, their stone steps layered with dust and ash. The great cathedrals, once filled with the thunder of choirs and the soft rustle of prayer, had grown hollow. Even the pigeons that used to roost in the rafters seemed to avoid them now, as though they too had learned to fear sacred ground. The bells had gone silent, their ropes stiff from disuse. Only the wind dared to pass through the aisles, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and wax ghosts of devotion long since burned out. The priests had withdrawn to the monasteries or vanished into the countryside. Some had died still clutching their crosses, others had abandoned them. Their vestments, once bright with gold thread, now hung forgotten behind locked sacristy doors. A few of the remaining clergy wandered the nave in silence, their eyes glazed with disbelief. They lit candles for the dead, though there was no one left to see the light. The people, for their part, had lost the habit of worship. Faith required gathering, and gathering had become death. They prayed, if at all, from behind their own doors softly, in whispers, afraid their words might carry contagion. Some no longer called it prayer, but bargaining. They offered promises, a life of virtue, a vow of silence, a future pilgrimage, if only the sickness would pass them by. When their families still fell ill, the promises turned to curses. In the cathedrals, the pews stood empty, row upon row of polished wood untouched by human hands. The sunlight still fell through the stained glass windows, but it no longer painted saints upon the floor. The colors were dull now, muted by dust and neglect. The images of angels seemed to look down in pity. The Christ on the crucifix had turned black with soot, and the flickering candlelight made him seem to tremble. Children, wandering hungry through the streets, sometimes slipped into the churches for shelter. They slept in the pews, their small bodies curled like commas in the half-light. The echo of their breathing filled the silence where prayers used to live. They didn't look at the altars, they didn't kneel. To them, the church was just another place that hadn't yet been taken by the plague. By morning, they would move on, leaving footprints across the marble floors. A single friar remained in one of the larger cathedrals by the river. Each dawn, he opened the doors and swept the dust from the threshold, though no one came. He still rang the bell once a week out of duty or perhaps hope. The sound rolled across the city like a sigh, reaching no ears that could answer. Sometimes he would speak aloud to the empty pews, delivering sermons to a congregation of shadows. His voice echoed back to him, softer each time. One night, a storm tore through the city. Lightning split the sky above the cathedral, illuminating the rose window in a sudden flash of color. The friar stood beneath it, watching the rain hammer the glass. He thought he saw movement inside the nave, a flicker of light, a shape kneeling in the front row, but when he drew closer, it was only the reflection of the candles he had forgotten to extinguish. When the storm passed, the pews were soaked from the rain blown in through the open doors. The friar walked among them, placing his hand on the cold wood. It was smooth and empty. So many had once knelt there, seeking comfort in faith. Now it felt like touching the ribs of a dead giant. The church was no longer a house of God, it was a tomb of belief, and its silence was the only prayer left. The city finally closed its eyes. At the edges of the walls where merchants once poured in with laughter, wagons, and song, new barriers rose, gates of timber, iron, and fear. They called it quarantine, a word meant to sound like protection, though it felt more like abandonment. The gates were locked with iron spikes and sealed with pitch. Beyond them stretched the open roads, silent and clean, and beyond that, the promise of life unspoiled. But no one inside would ever see that again. The guards who manned the gates were chosen from those who had already survived the sickness, though no one could be sure if survival meant immunity or borrowed time. They lived in tents just outside the walls, sleeping with their weapons close, forbidden to touch those they watched over. Each morning, they opened the smaller doors just wide enough for carts of bread and barrels of water, and closed them again before the wind could follow through. The citizens gathered there like beggars, reaching for what they could before the bolts slid home. Soon, the gates were not enough. Whole districts were walled off with timber and stone. The plague moved faster than any carpenter's hand, spreading through the cracks, the rooftops, the air itself. So the watchmen built higher, sealing bridges, blocking alleys, turning neighborhoods into islands of the dying. They called them safety zones. But there was no safety left, only time, and even that was measured in days. Families were separated without warning. If a single member showed a swelling or fever, the door was marked, and no one left again. The city that once thrived on its markets, its laughter, its closeness, became a patchwork of prisons. From the towers, it looked peaceful, a network of still courtyards, narrow streets, without movement. But below, the cries rose like wind through hollow pipes. At dusk, the air around the gates filled with the smell of smoke. Those outside burned pitch to keep the sickness from crossing. Those inside burned incense to hide its scent. The fires blurred together into one dark haze that smothered the skyline. On some nights, the gates would open for just a moment to let through a cart of grain or a priest carrying last rites, and the people would rush forward, arms outstretched, faces pressed to the bars. They begged for escape, for bread, for mercy. The guards did not meet their eyes. Stories spread of those who tried to flee, families who bribed the guards, lovers who scaled the walls, thieves who slipped through drains and rivers. Most never made it far. The countryside beyond the walls had learned its own lessons in fear. Villages posted sentries on their roads, armed with torches and arrows. The refugees were driven back toward the smoke from which they came. By the first frost, the gates had stopped opening altogether. The guards outside had vanished, leaving only the iron bolts rusting in their sockets. On the inner side, the people watched the horizon for any sign of help, an army, a doctor, a messenger from another world. But the fields stayed empty, the roads still, and so the city remained sealed in its own breath. The living and the dying trapped together behind their handmade walls. The gates no longer guarded them from the plague. They guarded the rest of the world from remembering them. By the time winter came, it was not only one city behind its walls, but many. Across Europe, from the Italian ports to the valleys of France, from London to Lubeck, whole towns sealed themselves in silence. The bells that once called to one another across the hills no longer rang. The roads were empty but for the crows, and even the rivers seemed to flow slower, thick with ash from the burning of the dead. Each settlement became an island surrounded by fear, watching its neighbors vanish behind curtains of smoke. In Florence, they said you could stand at the gates and see the bodies piled like stones against the walls. The living stayed inside, peering through cracks in the shutters, refusing to acknowledge the world beyond. Messengers stopped arriving. Letters lay unopened in courtyards, their wax seals unbroken. Even rumors died at the threshold. To open one's door was to invite the end. In Paris, the king fled to the countryside, his physicians in tow, leaving behind a city that governed itself in terror. The nobles locked their gates, their servants left to rot in the stables. Across the Seine, the poorer districts burned in what they called holy cleansing fires meant to purify the streets, though they consumed the houses as well. The air turned black for weeks, and the moon, when it appeared, was the color of iron. In Venice, the lagoon became a mirror of stillness. The ships that had once come by the hundreds sat abandoned, their ropes thick with moss. The plague houses on the outlying islands overflowed, and soon even the gondoliers refused to row near them. The sound of oars vanished. You could walk along the Grand Canal and hear nothing but the lapping of water against wood and the faint sigh of the sea. England fared no better. London's markets closed, the court dispersed, and the city's narrow lanes turned to labyrinths of death. Monks wrote the names of the fallen until ink ran dry. In the countryside, small villages barred travelers, hanging signs that read, "No entry until Judgment Day." They thought isolation would save them. Instead, it left them to die unseen. Even smaller towns mimicked the great cities, walls within walls, fear within fear. There were places where the inhabitants survived, but at a terrible cost. They forgot how to speak to one another. They flinched at the sight of strangers. They no longer trusted their own shadows. Some towns killed travelers on sight. Their bodies burned before questions could be asked. The dead were safer than the living. From afar, Europe must have looked like a dark constellation, clusters of faint fires, each a town burning its dead, each convinced it was the last light left in the world. The land between them turned wild again, overgrown and voiceless. Wolves came down from the hills, owls nested in the steeples. The roads, once thick with merchants and pilgrims, filled instead with weeds. And so, the cities closed their eyes not in rest, but in surrender. Behind their walls, humanity blinked itself into darkness, believing that if it did not look upon the plague would forget to look back. But the sickness did not need sight to find them. It moved like wind, patient and blind, through locked doors and dreams alike, until every city became identical in its silence. When the nobles fled to the hills and the priests shut themselves in their sanctuaries, a few souls remained behind, men and women who refused to run. They were the healers. Some were trained physicians, others herbalists, midwives, apothecaries, and barbers. Most had already lost everything: families, apprentices, the faith that once guided them. All they had left were their hands, and they kept using them, even when touch itself had become a death sentence. They worked in narrow rooms where the windows were nailed shut against bad air. Tables crowded with vials of vinegar, oil of rose, and bundles of dried herbs filled the space. Bowls of dark water, copper scalpels, and blood-stained rags lay in corners. The air was always hot and sweet, half medicine, half decay. They dressed in layers of waxed cloth and leather, and when even that was not enough, they wrapped scarves around their faces, their voices muffled into whispers. At first, people came to them in desperate faith. They brought their fevered children, their husbands shaking with chills, their wives faint with exhaustion. They begged for tonics and poultices, for prayers written on scraps of parchment, for hope in any form that could be swallowed. The healers gave what they could. Some bled their patients as they had been taught. Others turned to gentler ways, compresses of lavender and vinegar, infusions of willow and honey. A few simply sat beside the dying, holding their hands through the fever until both hands grew cold. Each day brought fewer patients and more corpses. Yet the healers persisted, moving from house to house with baskets of herbs slung across their shoulders. They learned to work in silence, for there were no thanks left to give. Those who survived called them blessed. Those who didn't cursed them for trying. Either way, the healers carried on. In Florence, a widow named Alessandra was said to have walked the streets at dusk, sprinkling rosemary water in doorways. She refused payment, saying only, "The scent must remind the soul where to go." When her own fever came, she asked to be buried barefoot, so I may still walk among the living. In Paris, an apothecary brewed vinegar laced with thyme and sold it to the city guards who manned the quarantine gates. They named it the Four Thieves Vinegar, claiming it could cheat death. In Venice, a doctor known as Giovanni the Silent made rounds in a beaked mask filled with mint and cloves. Children hid from him in terror, but mothers followed him, clutching their infants, begging to be marked safe. Not all healers died of the sickness. Some simply vanished, wandering into the countryside after their patients were gone, unable to bear the stillness of the city. A few left their journals behind, filled with shaky handwriting and recipes written between confessions. One note read, "It is not the plague that kills, but the loneliness that follows it." By the time spring returned, the healers' houses were as quiet as the churches. Their herbs had dried to dust, their tools rusted, their doors unlatched. Yet the faint smell of rosemary lingered in their rooms, like memory made visible, a fragile sign that someone, once, had chosen to stay when everyone else had fled. And in that lingering scent, there was a truth few could name aloud: that even in the darkest hour, the courage to tend to others is the last light the world forgets to extinguish. When the groan had run out of laughter, the children tried to borrow it back. They were the last to understand the enormity of it all, the silence, the smoke, the endless tolling of the bells. Death was everywhere, yet to them it still seemed like a strange sort of game. They played in the empty streets, their bare feet slapping against cobblestones still damp from rain and tears alike. When the carts rolled past, they hid behind walls, counting how long it took before the wheels disappeared from view. Some called out the names painted on the wooden planks, not realizing they were reading the names of the dead. The graveyards had become their playgrounds. The earth was soft there, freshly turned, and the grass grew uneven around the mounds. The children chased one another between the rows, leaping over the smaller graves as if over puddles, their laughter echoing against the chapel walls. They collected the discarded ribbons from the shrouds and tied them around their wrists. One girl found a rosary half buried in the dirt and wore it like a necklace. When the gravediggers told them to leave, they darted away like sparrows, only to return when the men's shovels fell silent again. No one stopped them. The adults were too tired, too broken. The sight of children laughing brought pain and comfort in equal measure. They were living proof that innocence still existed, but also a reminder that it would not last. Sometimes the smallest ones would fall ill after a day among the graves, first a cough, then a fever, then the dreaded black swellings. The mothers tried to keep them inside, but children are drawn to sunlight, even when it shines on death. They slipped through windows and climbed walls, returning to their playground of sorrow. They invented rules for their games. One played the priest, another the mourner. They took turns lying still in the grass, pretending to be corpses, while the others chanted nonsense psalms. In the evening they gathered pebbles and bones to build little towers, marking their own imaginary burials. When the wind blew, they said it was the dead answering back. A boy named Etienne was known among them as the gravedigger's son, though his own father had died in the first months. He found comfort in the work others feared. Each morning he brought flowers, dandelions, mostly, and placed them on the newest mound. The older children teased him until the day he vanished. Some said he followed the carts to the pits beyond the walls. Others swore they saw him later in the churchyard, standing perfectly still among the stones, as if waiting for someone to call his name. By the following winter, the laughter had faded. The graveyards grew too crowded, too cold. The children began to disappear one by one, their games replaced by silence. The ribbons they had tied to the fence posts fluttered in the wind long after they were gone. Years later, when travelers passed through those same burial grounds, they said they could still hear faint laughter in the evenings, high and distant, carried on the breeze. Perhaps it was only the wind moving through the grass. Or perhaps it was the memory of children who had tried, in the middle of the world's dying, to remind it how to play. In every home, the family Bible had once been the anchor, the one book that outlasted fires, floods, and famine. Its pages were worn from prayers, marked with ribbons, and penciled with the births and deaths of generations. But during the plague, even the Bible could not protect. It became a quiet witness to a world unraveling, a ledger of sorrow that no priest could absolve. Mothers clutched it to their chests as they lay beside the fevered children. Fathers opened it in vain, reading aloud verses that once promised hope, now swallowed by coughs and moans. The ink had faded with time, but the words still struck the ears of the dying like hollow bells. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. But want had grown too vast, and the shepherd seemed absent. Some families used the Bible as a shield. They piled it atop the heads of their children, thinking its weight might keep the sickness at bay. Others traced the letters with trembling fingers, murmuring the names of the afflicted into the margins, hoping the ink itself would carry their prayers beyond the walls. In some homes, the book was set aside entirely, left open on a table, its spine cracked, pages fluttering like wings whenever the wind entered through cracked shutters. The recording of births and deaths in the margins took on a grim rhythm. Every page carried the marks of survival and loss. Dates of baptism were interspersed with hastily penciled notes of deaths. Eleanor, age 7, taken March 14. Thomas, age 20, fever, May 3. Families began to lose track of who remained alive. The Bible, once a testament to continuity, became a ledger of erasure. It was said that in the wealthier homes, gilded Bibles were carried to the bedside of every fevered soul. Even the poorest pressed their small leather-bound editions into the palms of trembling children. They read the Psalms aloud, not for God, but for themselves, an attempt to impose order, to measure the chaos, to feel something beyond helplessness. The voices cracked after hours of recitation, but still they read. Sometimes a neighbor would come, hearing the words from the next house, and add their voice to the chorus. Some families marked the Bible with more than names. They sketched crosses in the margins, hoping to guide the spirits of the dead. Others wrote little prayers that no one else could read, confessions of guilt for surviving when others had not. In one town, a young boy recorded the names of every corpse he saw carted past his window, the letters growing jagged and uneven as the weeks passed. He called the pages "My Own City of the Dead," and the book became the only companion he trusted. By the time spring returned, many Bibles had been abandoned. Pages were stuck together with sweat and blood, ribbons scorched from candle flames, corners eaten by rats. Yet some survived, kept hidden beneath floorboards or in chests. Those that remained were more than books, they were memory itself. A family could be gone, but the Bible endured, bearing witness to what had been and what would never come again. And in the quiet nights, when the wind blew through empty streets and the fires of burned houses smoked into the sky, the pages of the family Bibles whispered. They carried the grief, the fear, and the last prayers of a world that had watched itself fall, waiting for hands to turn them once more. By the time the plague reached the courts, the crowns had begun to weigh heavier than the kings themselves. Monarchs who had once ruled with certainty now found their authority hollowed by absence and fear. Councils that once managed war, trade, and justice collapsed under the strain of sickness and death. Advisors and nobles fell first, leaving empty seats at long tables where strategies and decrees had once been debated. The kingdoms began to unravel, not from armies, but from the invisible hand that swept through the cities and the countryside alike. In England, the court of London grew quieter each day. The king, still young and untested, watched from the windows of his hall as the streets emptied. Nobles refused to attend council meetings, fearful that the plague would claim them before they could speak. Letters were sent back and forth, but most never reached their destination. The few messengers who survived the journey returned pale and fevered, bringing news of death rather than guidance. Without counsel, the king could issue no orders, and the law itself became a relic of a world already gone. Across the continent, similar scenes unfolded. In Paris, the Dauphin withdrew into the Palais de la Cité, his advisors dead or quarantined. Roads into the city were blocked by gates and guards, each man wary of the approaching pestilence. Messages from provinces went unanswered. Fields were left untended. Markets rotted with unsold goods. Farmers abandoned their villages to hide in forests, leaving the cities to decay in isolation. The king's voice carried only through decrees nailed to empty squares, read by few, obeyed by fewer. Italy's city-states fared no better. Florence and Venice, usually bustling with trade, fell silent. Councils that had managed commerce and diplomacy became ghost rooms, the chairs empty, the ledgers untouched. Doges and dukes sent letters to one another, each hoping that the plague might spare their own city while claiming their plague spines, neighbors. Fear became currency. Decisions were made in whispers, if at all. Those who could leave fled to country estates or monasteries, leaving the common folk to fend for themselves. Even the distant kingdoms of Iberia and the northern lands were not spared. The monarchs retreated to fortified castles, barricading themselves against the unknown. But the pestilence did not respect walls or gates. News of deaths in the villages and towns filtered back slowly, arriving as a chorus of dread rather than a report. With each passing week, the rulers became more isolated, their power confined to the few miles immediately around their palaces. In the shadows, the people learned to manage themselves. Towns formed rudimentary councils of survivors. Guilds took on responsibilities once reserved for kings or magistrates. Decisions were made with practicality and fear, often brutally, for there were too few to allow dissent. The plague had inverted the hierarchy of the world without kings, the people governed by survival alone, and the concept of authority began to feel fragile, almost meaningless. By the winter of that first year, the kingdoms were kingdoms only in name. The crowns sat on empty thrones, the banners flew over walls held only by smoke and memory, and the streets whispered of rulers who could no longer lead. The people, too few to fill the markets, adapted or perished. In the quiet that followed the tolling bells, a single truth became apparent. In a world ruled by pestilence, kings were powerless, and survival had become the only law. The roads out of the city were empty, but they were not silent. Smoke rose from every quarter, twisting into the sky like black fingers pointing toward heaven. Each chimney, each burning pyre, each smoldering heap of possessions left behind by those who had fled or fallen became part of a network of ash and odor that stretched across the countryside. The wind carried it, drifting over fields and forests, over rivers and villages, until the world itself seemed wrapped in a shroud of grey. Merchants had abandoned the trade routes long before, leaving wagons half buried in mud or overturned in the ditches. Travelers who dared to move were few, moving like ghosts across a land already haunted. Smoke from the cities mingled with smoke from burned farms, creating a haze so thick that the sun itself became a dim orb, casting nothing but muted shadows. Those who remained behind said the air tasted of iron and char, and even the water in wells seemed darker, carrying the scent of the fires that had become the only defense against the invisible sickness. The roads were lined with the abandoned and the lost. Horses, unclaimed, wandered between the ruts, nibbling at frost-hardened grass. Packs of dogs, feral and starving, followed the smoke, sniffing for bodies, for food, for anything to distract them from the silence. Occasionally, a traveler would appear, gaunt and trembling, carrying what little they could save. They avoided villages, avoided farms, avoided the towns whose gates were closed, the people barricaded inside. The smoke warned them, life ended here, and you may not pass. Alongside the smoke, rumors traveled faster than the wind. Some said the plague had learned to ride it, carried on the curls of soot from one village to the next. Others whispered that those who fled carried it in their breath, that the smoke itself had become a harbinger. Townspeople lit fires at crossroads, burning herbs and incense, hoping the smell would confuse the sickness, though no one truly believed it could. Children crouched behind doors, holding scarves over their noses, watching the pale smoke drift past like the breath of a giant. By midday, the roads were nearly impassable. The ash coated the feet of anyone moving, mixing with mud to form a grey paste that stuck to boots and hooves alike. Travelers left footprints that vanished quickly, smothered by the next gust of wind or the next flake of soot falling from the sky. At night, the smoke glowed faintly from the fires still burning in abandoned homes, giving the illusion of lanterns, guiding no one but the dead. Even the forests were not spared. Trees blackened along the edges of villages, smoke curling among the branches like serpents. The animals retreated, birds ceased to sing, and the rivers reflected only grey light, rippling with ash on their surface. The roads, once avenues of commerce and communication, had become arteries of dread, veins through which the silence and smoke flowed. By winter, the roads had become almost invisible. Travelers spoke of moving blindly through a world that seemed to exist only in ash and shadow, where smoke blurred the horizon and death was never far behind. Those who survived spoke in whispers, telling tales of the blackened paths that connected every town, every city, every grave. The roads of smoke were no longer passageways. They were the memory of a world burning quietly into its own oblivion. Long before the plague had consumed cities, the faithful had taken to the roads. Pilgrims walked alone through the countryside, their sandals worn thin, staffs clutched like lifelines, and robes stiff with sweat and ash. They did not travel for glory or trade, nor for adventure, but for mercy. Each step was a prayer, each breath a petition to God that the sickness might pass them by. or that the souls of the dead might find peace. Yet the roads were emptying of life, and even the faithful found that faith was a fragile thing when the air itself carried death. At dawn, the mist hung thick over the fields, clinging to the knees of the travelers, soaking their robes. Birds were silent, and the only sound came from the steady tap of staffs against cobblestones or the soft crunch of leaves in the forest. Occasionally, a cart passed in the distance, but it moved slower than usual, drawn by a horse with ribs showing, carrying goods abandoned halfway to market. The pilgrims passed it without stopping, wary that any contact could bring the plague closer. Some walked with rosaries clutched in trembling hands, murmuring prayers for themselves and for the countless others whose names were already fading from memory. Others carried relics of saints, small pieces of cloth or wood, believing that proximity to holiness might form a shield against the unseen. Yet even relics could not protect them from the wind that carried death across the countryside, the same wind that had entered the city gates and never left. Along the roads, the pilgrims encountered villages in silence. Doors were nailed shut, windows darkened. Fires burned at the edges of towns, smoke rising in thick columns that twisted into the sky. Sometimes the travelers glimpsed figures behind the shutters, eyes wide, faces drawn with fear. A mother might clutch her child, a man might kneel alone in the yard, praying for someone, anyone, to survive. The pilgrims walked past, leaving behind only the faint scent of incense and their own whispered prayers. Even in the wilderness, danger lingered. The forests were quiet, but the paths were littered with the dead, those who had fled the cities only to succumb to fever and thirst. The pilgrims learned quickly to step over them, to leave a stone at each side as a mark, a prayer, or a warning to others. Occasionally, they would bury a small body, covering it with leaves and mud, saying a blessing over it for the dead and for the living who might follow the same path. By evening, the travelers would stop at a hill or a river, setting up a small fire, careful not to draw attention. They ate sparingly, drank from the streams, and wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they had brought. The nights were long and cold, and the silence pressed against them like a living thing. In the darkness, the groans of the dying seemed to drift on the wind, carrying across miles, and the pilgrims shivered not only from cold, but from the awareness that no matter how far they walked, the plague was everywhere. Some did not survive the journey. Bodies were left by the roadside, marked with crosses, prayers, or simply stones piled on top. Those who continued moved slower, more cautious, haunted by the dead who had come before them. Yet still they walked. For in the quiet terror of the plague, to walk was to resist despair, to insist that life, fragile as it was, might still carry meaning through the roads of death. The pilgrims who walked alone became legends among those who remained, their journeys remembered not for distance traveled, but for courage in a world that had learned to fear its own breath. It began with chalk marks, small crosses drawn hastily on the shutters of homes where fever had taken hold. At first, it was subtle, a warning to neighbors, a sign for the watchman, a note that someone inside was ill. But soon, the marks grew darker, heavier. Black flags were hung in doorways, pieces of cloth stitched or torn from whatever could be found. They flapped weakly in the wind, a signal both to the living and to the dead that this house, this family, had been claimed by the sickness. The flags were meant to warn, but they carried a different power entirely. Children, curious and terrified, dared not enter the alleys where they hung. Dogs refused to cross the thresholds. Neighbors hurried past, muttering prayers or crossing themselves as if the cloth alone could carry contagion. The city became a landscape of black banners, fluttering gently in empty streets, moving only with the wind, yet holding the weight of innumerable lives lost. Families within the houses stared at the cloth and waited. The sick lay in narrow beds, their bodies curled beneath thin blankets, eyes bright with fever and fear. Mothers tried to soothe them, fathers whispered prayers, children clutched whatever comfort they could find. But the black flags outside made the house seem smaller, the walls closer. Every breath felt dangerous, every step to the door might carry the plague further. Silence became their companion, and hope a fragile, fleeting shadow. The watchmen, who once patrolled streets and torches in hand, moved with extra caution past the flagged homes. Some would tap lightly on the doors with their staffs, calling out the name of the sick, but few dared enter. When they found a body, it was left where it fell until the cart arrived, its wheels groaning under the weight of the dead. Families had learned to accept that death might come while the black flag still hung, marking not only the presence of illness, but the inevitability of loss. Merchants and bakers refused to deliver to homes with flags. Water was left in buckets at the thresholds. Bread was tossed over the low walls. Anything brought inside was done quickly, carefully, and without touch. Children watched the process in silence, learning the rules of survival that the adults had not yet fully spoken. The black flags became a language of their own, a code for fear, grief, and the unspoken knowledge that some would not live to see the next sunrise. In some neighborhoods, the flags began to dominate the landscape. Entire streets became lined with them, swaying in the wind like a dark forest of cloth. The living moved in the spaces between, careful not to brush against the fluttering fabric. Fires from nearby homes filled the streets with smoke and shadows, giving the banners an almost spectral presence. They seemed alive, warning, accusing, mourning simultaneously. By autumn, the black flags had transformed the city. They were no longer merely markers of sickness, they were symbols of absence, proof of the lives that had ended and the fragility of those still clinging to existence. The wind carried their image far beyond the streets, and travelers entering the city saw only a town draped in darkness, a place where the air itself seemed to acknowledge death's dominion. The black flags on the door were simple, yet unyielding. They told the world what words could not, that the plague did not ask for permission, did not discriminate, and would claim all in its path. And for those who lived behind them, each flutter was a constant reminder that the line between life and death had become impossibly thin. When the men had fallen, fled, or been claimed by the sickness, the women took the fields. It was not a choice born of desire or duty alone, but of necessity. Crops would not wait, and the land demanded tending, whether the hands were strong or fevered. Mothers, widows, daughters, even the youngest girls who could hold a hoe or drag a basket, became farmers, herders, and laborers. The world had shifted, and so had their roles. The mornings were the hardest. Mist clung to the ground, and the chill of the earth seeped through layers of wool and leather. The women walked barefoot or in thin shoes, their fingers raw from gripping tools. Every furrow they cut, every seed they sowed, carried the weight of survival. There was no one to help, no neighbor to share the load. The sickness had thinned the population so drastically that even a single day without work could mean the loss of the harvest. The fields were quiet, except for the sounds of labor, hoes striking soil, baskets scraping over stony paths, and the occasional cough breaking the rhythm of the day. The women worked quickly, speaking only when necessary. Children ran between the rows, gathering vegetables or chasing stray chickens, their laughter faint against the hum of toil. When a woman faltered, another would steady her, offering a hand or a whispered word of encouragement. Compassion survived in small gestures, fragile as the green shoots beneath their feet. Some of the women carried the sick in their arms while tending the fields, swaddled in linen or blankets, their eyes glazed with fever. They worked around them as best they could, building makeshift shelters of straw and wood so that no one lay exposed to the sun or wind. Even as the labor drained their own strength, they pressed on. Survival had become a collective act, bound not by law or lordship, but by necessity and fear. The sun burned hot overhead, and the wind carried the scent of soil and sweat, mingled with smoke from nearby fires set to cleanse the air. Wolves and scavenging dogs roamed closer to villages emptied by plague. Yet still, the women pressed on, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of danger or opportunity. They learned the rhythms of the land, remembered which fields were richer, which wells held clean water, and how to move through the countryside without drawing attention to themselves. Evenings brought no relief. Work in the fields gave way to cooking, fetching water, and tending the sick who had survived the day. The same hands that dug furrows now kneaded dough or bandaged a fevered child, and when the last light faded behind the hills, the women would gather in small groups, leaning on one another, listening to the wind and the faint tolling of distant bells. Some prayed, some sat in silence. All were exhausted beyond measure, yet none faltered completely. Through the long months, the women in the fields became the backbone of survival. They carried the world on their shoulders when everyone else had vanished. The plague had stolen fathers, husbands, and sons. But it could not take the strength, ingenuity, or endurance of the women who refused to leave the land untended. They were the keepers of life in a world obsessed with death, and their courage carved a fragile path through the shadow of the Black Plague. Months had passed since the smoke first settled over the city, since the black flags marked every door, and since the carts carried away the dead without pause. The streets had lain empty, silent but for the wind and the distant tolling of bells. Life had been reduced to whispers, cautious steps, and the flickering hope that someone, somewhere, would survive. Yet one morning, when the sun pierced the fog with a thin ribbon of gold, a sound broke through the silence. A voice human, soft, uncertain rose from a courtyard. It began with a cough, then another, and another, until a man emerged from a shuttered doorway, blinking against the sunlight. He walked slowly, dragging his feet over the cobblestones, carrying a basket of whatever food he could find. When he passed the town square, he called out a greeting, a simple, "Good morning." The sound startled those still hidden behind shutters. Some held their breath, some laughed, unable to believe that a human could speak freely without fear. Soon, others joined him. Mothers peered from windows and doorways, calling to their neighbors. Children crept from hiding places, blinking in the brightness, laughing quietly at first, then with growing confidence. The town had learned to whisper, to avoid contact, to hold their voices tight. And now, those same voices began to spill into the open, shaky and uncertain, but alive. The market reopened, cautiously at first. Stalls were hastily cleaned, barrels wiped down, bread stacked on tables, some stale, some fresh. Merchants and survivors spoke through masks of cloth or scarves soaked in vinegar. Bargains were exchanged, goods measured with trembling hands. For the first time in months, the town smelled not only of smoke and decay, but of bread, herbs, and hope. The churches, once empty, began to fill again. A few of the surviving priests returned to their pulpits, their voices cracking as they recited prayers aloud. People knelt awkwardly, unsure of how to pray after so long. Some sat silently, listening, afraid that even speech might summon the plague back. But slowly, confidence returned. The sound of collective voices, singing or speaking, felt like sunlight warming frozen stone. Families reunited in courtyards. Children ran between alleys and rooftops, their laughter a strange, bright sound against the backdrop of ash and ruin. Women in the fields returned with baskets of vegetables, tending small gardens that had survived the chaos. Men began to clear debris from streets, repairing doors and windows, stacking bricks where walls had fallen. Life, fragile as it was, began to pulse again through the town. Yet the people remembered. They moved cautiously, checking the shadows, marking doors with chalk before entering, wary of hidden illness. Every greeting, every handshake, was measured, weighed, and considered. Trust had been eroded by months of fear, and it would take years to rebuild. Still, the act of speaking, of sharing the same air without dread, was revolutionary. By nightfall, the town hummed with life for the first time in ages. Fires burned in hearths, the smell of cooked food drifting over the streets. Children slept in warmth, mothers and fathers by their sides. The bells, silent for so long, were rung again not to toll for the dead, but to signal the return of life. Tentative, yet undeniable. In that moment, the town spoke again. it whispered, it laughed, it prayed. And the people understood that even in a world scarred by the Black Plague, voices human, fragile, and persistent were enough to remind them that they were still alive. The survivors were not all adults. In the aftermath of the worst months, the children who had endured the sickness emerged into a world that was both familiar and alien. Their eyes were older than their years, their hands scarred with fever and neglect. Some had lost their parents, others had been orphaned by neighbors who never returned from the carts that carried away the dead. Yet they walked the streets, tentative but alive, learning to navigate the ruins of the city and the ashes of homes that had once been full of laughter. These children moved differently than those who had grown up in times of peace. They were cautious, wary of the wind, the stones, and every shadow that might conceal illness. They flinched at the touch of others, holding their distance even from each other. Yet in the quiet moments, when the sun fell low and painted the walls of the city gold, they played. Games were simple, and small stones rolled between fingers, sticks dragged through the dirt, whispered stories of friends who had disappeared. Laughter, when it came, was soft and fragile, like the flutter of a bird's wings. The streets themselves became their playground. Empty markets, once crowded with merchants and carts, now held nothing but debris and the occasional stray animal. Children ran between overturned barrels, leaping over fallen beams, using walls as markers for their imagined worlds. In the graveyards, where adults dared not tread, they wandered freely, picking flowers that had grown among the mounds, gathering the bones of small animals for curious examination. They understood instinctively what the adults had forgotten. The earth belonged to no one, yet it held the memory of everything. Education came in strange forms. There were no teachers, no schools, only the whispers of older children who remembered scraps of prayer, the letters on pages that survived the fires, and the lessons of survival. They learned which streets to avoid, which wells had clean water, which abandoned houses still held food. They mimicked the gestures of adults, lighting small fires for warmth, carrying water in buckets, tending to younger siblings or the sick who had survived. Each day was a mixture of play and ritual, of survival and memory. Some children became leaders by necessity. A boy named Matteo, who had survived alone for weeks after his family succumbed, organized small groups to forage for food. He learned quickly which paths were safe, which doors could be opened, and how to avoid the streets still marked by black flags. Others followed him, trusting instinct rather than law, sharing the meager finds and teaching each other how to move quietly, how to speak softly, and how to remain unseen. By winter, the children had created a fragile society of their own. They spoke little, but their cooperation was instinctive. They scavenged, cleaned, and organized the city in ways adults had abandoned. And though the plague had claimed much, the children's resilience carried the possibility of a new beginning. They were the memory of the dead and the promise of life intertwined, carrying forward a world irrevocably altered, yet still breathing. In the years to come, they would remember the silence, the smoke, the empty streets, and the black flags. But they would also remember the first warmth of sunlight on their faces, the faint echo of laughter, and the knowledge that even in a city claimed by death, life could endure in the smallest and most unexpected ways. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. One bell tolled in the distance, its voice thin and wavering, as though uncertain of its own existence. The city, still scarred by months of silence, paused to listen. Windows that had been shuttered for so long cracked open, shutters rattling in the wind as the sound carried across the empty streets. For the first time in what felt like a year, the people realized that something familiar, something once taken for granted, had returned. The bell's tone was weak at first, a single note that lingered in the air, vibrating against stone walls and the hollow spaces between rooftops. One by one, other bells joined, answering from towers across the city. The sound was uneven, some higher, some lower, some far away, but together they formed a chorus of presence, a reminder that life, however fragile, persisted. Mothers peeked from windows, children ran to the streets, their small voices blending with the distant tolling. It was as though the city itself had begun to breathe again. The bells did more than sound. They marked the rhythm of a returning world. Markets reopened, cautiously at first. The street vendors who had survived the plague hung their wares, letting sunlight catch the edges of pots, cloth, and baskets. The bells tolling became a heartbeat, guiding the living through a city that had forgotten the cadence of daily life. It was a signal. The dead had not claimed everything, and there was still a place for the living to occupy. In the churches, priests returned as well, tentative but determined. The bells called them to their pulpits once more. Candles were relit, incense burned again, and the first sermons in months were spoken aloud. The words were halting, uncertain, yet their meaning resonated differently now. They were not prayers for absolution alone. They were declarations that the city could endure, that those who remained had a right to claim life again. The children noticed the change most vividly. They had wandered the empty streets, played among graves, and learned to navigate ruins. Now, with the bells ringing, they moved differently. Their footsteps were lighter, their laughter more confident. Some danced between the shadows, spinning ribbons that had been saved from the black flags. Others ran to the towers, waving, hoping to glimpse the faces of those who rang the bells. The sound became a bridge between past and present, a link between fear and cautious hope. Merchants, artisans, and farmers followed the rhythm of the bells, returning to work with care. The scent of bread, the hum of tools, the faint smoke of cooking fires, all were carried along by the sound, weaving a fragile tapestry of life across streets once empty. The city had learned to listen again. The bells, which had once tolled only for the dead, now marked the living. By nightfall, the city had changed. Fires burned in hearths, shadows moved with intent, and voices rose cautiously to speak with neighbors. Even the wind seemed lighter, carrying the echoes of the bells over rooftops and across the hills. For the first time in months, there was a sense of rhythm, a sense of presence, a reminder that the city had survived the unthinkable. The return of the bells did not erase the memory of death, nor did it undo the months of terror, loss, and silence. But it offered the first proof that the world could resume its shape, that life could reclaim the streets, and that even in a city once claimed by plague, the living had found a voice again. When the plague had passed through the towns and cities, it left more than empty streets and shuttered houses. It left memory scarred, fields that had once been known by the names of families, by the toil of hands and the cycles of planting and harvest, became anonymous stretches of grey and ash. Meadows, hills, and forests, once alive with the laughter of children and the chatter of farmers, were silent. Even the rivers seemed to have forgotten the names of the villages they passed. The land itself had become a stranger. Travelers who returned months later could not recognize the countryside. Paths that had once led to markets or monasteries were overgrown with weeds, their edges obscured by the debris of abandoned homes. Stone fences lay in ruins, gates rotted on their hinges. Orchards grew wild, apples blackened and falling to the ground. Villages were gone, swallowed by fear and fire, replaced with empty shells where doors creaked in the wind and windows stared blindly. To walk these lands was to move through a world stripped of familiarity, where every landmark had been altered or erased. The survivors who returned to the fields often forgot their own farmsteads. Names that had been spoken daily, Grandfather's Hill, the Mill of St. Crispin, the willow by the stream, escaped their memory. When they tried to retrace steps to wells or barns, they wandered in circles, startled by unfamiliar trees and collapsed walls. Even those who had survived near the same streets could no longer call the corners by their old names. Children were born into the silence, learning the land only through touch and instinct, never by the stories of elders that had been lost to the sickness. Rivers carried their own kind of forgetting. Boats that once ferried goods and people now drifted alone. Bridges were broken or unmaintained. The water reflected the grey sky. bearing the memory of ash and smoke from burned towns, and in its movement, the stories of names of families, of trades, of festivals dissolved into whispers no one alive could hear. Fishermen returned to the banks, but the currents seemed unfamiliar. The fish scattered into waters no longer called by their names. Even the wind seemed to carry uncertainty, moving freely over the lands without the language of the past. Some survivors tried to reclaim the land with markers, stakes, and inscriptions, writing names of homes, fields, and wells wherever they could. But the plague had taught them impermanence. The markers were soon forgotten. The ink faded, the stakes rotted. The memory of what had been alive in the land could not endure the silence left behind. Nature, unchecked by human hands, reclaimed everything. By late autumn, the land itself had become an archive of absence. Paths, fields, and hills were recorded only in the movements of the living, their footsteps tracing stories that would fade by morning. The plough broke ground in forgotten soil. The harvest gathered in vague shadows of what had been planted. Villagers learned to live without history, navigating a countryside that remembered nothing yet demanded everything. And in the quiet of the night, when the wind swept through the abandoned towns and over the ruins of farms, the survivors understood a simple truth. The plague had not only taken life, it had taken memory. The land had forgotten its names, and in forgetting, had become both a warning and a home for those who remained, a place where survival depended not on the past, but only on the care taken with each uncertain step into the grey and shadowed present. After months of smoke, ash, and empty streets, the fires returned, not the cleansing pyres of the sick, nor the torches of watchmen patrolling fearful alleys, but the small, deliberate flames of survival. Hearths were relit in homes that had stood dark for months. Chimneys that had coughed only smoke now gave off the smell of wood and warmth. The people who had survived the plague began to reclaim their lives, tentatively, carefully, and the fires became the first sign that life, fragile and uneven, was returning. In the early mornings, the smell of burning wood drifted from kitchen windows across the empty streets. Mothers stirred porridge, bakers kneaded dough, and children gathered near embers to warm themselves. Smoke curled lazily into the sky, a gentle reminder that hands still labored, that bodies still moved, and that the heart of the city could still beat. Even the dogs, wary of the open streets, returned to watch the flames, lying beside the fires like small sentinels. Farmers tended their fields with fires at the edges, burning weeds, sterilizing soil, and clearing debris left by months of abandonment. The flames seemed to push back the grey ash that had settled everywhere, giving color and movement to the land that had been grey for so long. Men who had fled the cities returned, carrying wood and tools, rebuilding fences, repairing roofs, and lighting lamps at dusk. Fires, once signals of death, had become symbols of endurance. The churches were among the first to embrace flame. Candles were lit in altars and chapels, their soft glow flickering over the faces of the few survivors who returned to pray. Monks and priests whispered again, reading passages that had been forgotten during the months of silence. The light shone across the stone floors and gilded icons, reminding all who entered that though the city had been claimed by death, it could still hold warmth and faith. Even the bells, once dormant, were rung in accompaniment to the fires, a song of both mourning and cautious joy. In the markets, small fires were used to smoke herbs and cook food. Merchants who survived the plague displayed goods over the embers, baking bread on open stones, roasting meat, and boiling water to cleanse what could be salvaged. Children played near the hearths, laughing softly, their shadows dancing on walls scarred by soot. The fires became centers of community, gathering points in a world that had forgotten how to congregate, teaching people once more that warmth could be shared, even in a city still haunted by absence. Even at night, when the wind carried the smell of ash from burned homes and the memory of carts rolling through streets, the new fires stood defiant. They were low, controlled, deliberate flames to mark living bodies, to feed the weak, to remind the living of what remained. Those who survived leaned close to the hearths, cupping their hands around the warmth, sharing stories of loved ones, of neighbors who had vanished, and of a world they would rebuild slowly, one ember at a time. By midwinter, the fires had multiplied across the city. Each household carried its own flame, each hearth a small rebellion against the silence that had once claimed every street. Smoke, once a symbol of destruction, now became a thread connecting people to the present and to one another. In the glow of the returning fires, the survivors began to understand something simple yet profound. The plague had taken much, but it could not take the human need for warmth, for light, and for the flickering, fragile heart of life. The world that emerged after the fires was one shaped by absence and endurance. The children who survived the plague carried the weight of months they could barely understand, but their eyes held a wisdom far beyond their years. They had seen their parents fall, their neighbors vanish, their streets emptied of sound and laughter. Yet, in the quiet after the smoke had lifted, they began to reclaim what was left, not the wealth of the cities, nor the authority of the kings, but the small, essential pulse of life that refused to be extinguished. These children moved cautiously through the streets, learning the new rhythms of a city that had forgotten how to live. They played near the fires, careful not to get too close, knowing instinctively the boundaries between warmth and danger. They scavenged for food, picking what had survived the months of scarcity, sharing bread crusts, scraps of meat, and dried fruits. They learned to barter with one another, not with coins, but with acts of labor, trust, and small favors. Survival had become a lesson taught daily in the narrow alleys and ruined courtyards. Even games were altered by their experiences. Hide and seek became a matter of vigilance. Racing along the cobblestones required constant attention to the empty windows, the blackened doorways, the creaking timbers of abandoned homes. They whispered to one another, speaking softly, learning early that sound carried far and could alert the unseen dangers still lingering in the city. Shadows had grown longer in their minds, stretching from memory and fear, but the children still found ways to laugh, to run, to lift one another from despair. Even for a moment, education too was improvised. Elders who survived the plague, teachers, scribes, priests, offered what lessons they could. They taught reading from the few salvaged books, writing in the margins of journals, counting with pebbles and sticks. The children learned not only letters and numbers, but also caution, observation, and the subtle wisdom of patience. Every step was measured, every choice deliberate. The plague had taught them that life was fragile, and they carried that knowledge in their bones. Some children became leaders, organizing groups to clear streets, tend fires, and guard the small gardens that had begun to flourish again. Matteo, a boy who had lost his family early, became a guide to the younger ones, teaching them which wells still held clean water, which alleys were safe to traverse, and how to navigate the ruins of homes that might still shelter food or tools. His small group became the nucleus of a new community, a fragile network of cooperation that slowly knit the city back together. By the time spring returned, these children were no longer just survivors. They were the inheritors of a city rebuilt from silence. Their laughter, still cautious, rang through the streets. Their hands worked the fields, the hearths, and the workshops. Their voices learned to speak again. In them, the city found hope. They carried the memory of loss, yes, but also the promise of renewal. And though the adults remained haunted by absence and grief, the children reminded them that the world, even after devastation, could still be tended, played in, and loved. The survivors' children became the first to breathe fully in the space the plague had left behind, bridging the gap between what was lost and what might yet be saved. It had been months since the first bell had rung again, and yet the sound remained strange to the ears of the living. The tolling was no longer simply a marker of hours or announcements, but a signal that life had begun to reclaim the city. From the highest towers, the bells sang once more, and their echoes spilled down into streets still scarred by smoke, fire, and absence. The sound carried over rooftops, curling through alleys, and settling into the hearts of those who had dared to survive. The priests, hesitant at first, climbed the towers again, protesting ropes stiffened by neglect. The swing of the heavy bronze bells groaned, protesting against the years of disuse, yet they rang nonetheless. Each toll seemed to shake the air, to awaken the city from its long slumber. Windows opened cautiously, the first faces peering through dust-streaked glass. Children pressing hands to the frame, listening as the sound rolled past. Even the animals seemed to stir, as though recognizing the rhythm of life once again. Markets reopened with care. The merchants, their hands trembling with age and fatigue, stacked wares carefully on tables. The smell of bread, fresh herbs, and roasted meat drifted into streets, blending with the faint smoke of fires rekindled for warmth and cooking. People spoke cautiously, their voices raised enough to be heard but soft enough to honor the lessons of months spent in fear. The bells tolling gave them rhythm, moments for work, moments for pause, and moments to remember those who would never hear the sound again. In the churches, candles were lit for the first time in weeks. The priests led small gatherings of survivors in tentative prayers. The sound of hymns, once distant and hesitant, began to fill the nave, echoing off stone and fresco alike. The young sang beside the elders, some unsure of the words, others improvising, yet all joining together in the first chorus of collective hope. The bells above punctuated each verse, a constant reminder that the world outside had begun to reclaim its shape. Children, once cautious and withdrawn, ran through the streets again, their steps light, their laughter tentative but real. They chased one another along cobblestones, spinning ribbons left over from festivals that would never be repeated, their shadows flickering in the golden afternoon light. The bells marked their play, giving a cadence to each footfall, each whisper, each shout. For the first time in months, the city seemed to breathe in unison. Yet the bells did more than signal survival, they reminded the living of absence. Each toll carried with it the memory of the dead, friends, neighbors, siblings, and strangers whose names had been forgotten. The sound pressed on the heart, a measure of grief alongside celebration. Those who survived could not ignore it, and yet they embraced it, for the bells had returned to mark the living as well. By nightfall, the city was full of small fires, the smell of cooked food, and the soft chatter of cautious reunion. The bells tolled in steady rhythm, weaving together past sorrow and present hope. The sound carried far into the hills, over rivers and forests, a reminder that even after devastation, life could resume, fragile and uneven, but undeniably present. The city had begun to speak again, not in whispers, but in the ringing of bronze, announcing to the world that those who remained had found their voice. The city had begun to breathe again, yet some parts of life remained suspended, as if the plague had stolen more than just the living. There were no weddings, no bells rang in celebration, no brides in white glided down streets once bustling with pageantry and song. The months stretched on, and the spaces once filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses remained silent. People moved past one another in the streets with eyes lowered, speaking in measured tones, hesitant even to touch. The plague had robbed them not only of friends and family but of joy itself. Courtiers in their mansions, who might once have arranged unions to secure alliances, sat in parlors alone, the faint scent of perfume lingering in rooms no longer shared. Letters of intent, proposals of marriage, and invitations went unanswered, piling in heaps where servants could not sort them. Even the most practical unions, meant to preserve wealth or land, were abandoned. No one could risk gatherings that might carry the sickness further. The calendar became meaningless. The festivals marking engagement and courtship were reduced to memory, old stories that could not be reenacted. In the smaller homes, families huddled together, silent, fearful that celebration might tempt death to return. A mother might hold her daughter's hand while sewing a gown she would never wear. A father might sharpen the knives in anticipation of work, not feasting. The absence of weddings became a shadow over all other life events. Births were marked quietly, deaths noted with somber efficiency, but no ceremony was spared for love. Even prayers for happy unions were whispered at home, the voices low, half afraid that God might not answer. The children of the plague, now growing older, had never seen a wedding. They watched adults move silently through the streets, their eyes averted from one another, their hands too busy with survival to reach for companionship. The concept of celebration became abstract, the lesson taught only in stories read from the charred margins of books that had survived the fires. Some attempted to fashion makeshift ceremonies with scraps of cloth or flowers found growing among the graves, but the playfulness could not erase the emptiness of the streets around them. By midsummer, a few couples ventured into private courtyards, hoping to reclaim a sliver of what had been lost. They exchanged vows in whispers, their eyes bright with both joy and fear, aware that the world outside the walls could not be trusted. A neighbor might glimpse them, turn away quickly, and say nothing. The city, though slowly recovering, still demanded caution. Each act of love was measured, each embrace a calculated risk. The year stretched on, and the memory of weddings became a quiet ache in the hearts of the living. Some prayed for a return of festivals, for the restoration of music, for a time when joy could be safely celebrated again. And when the first bell rang for a wedding months later, carried through streets that had been emptied by months of plague, the sound felt heavier than ever. It carried with it the hope of survival, the weight of absence, and the promise that life, fragile and tentative, might still hold space for love. The year without weddings became a story told in whispers, a reminder of what was lost, of what had been stolen by the plague, and of the resilience required to reclaim even the smallest celebrations in a world forever changed. The smoke returned, but it was no longer the smoke of pyres or the cleansing fires of desperation. It drifted over the countryside from the hearths of survivors, curling from chimneys, spreading from kitchens and bakeries, and marking the tentative return of life. It rose slowly, in thin columns at first, then thickened as more homes were rebuilt, fires rekindled, and warmth once again claimed the air. Where the streets had been silent, now they hummed faintly with the sounds of labor, the scrape of tools, and the cautious laughter of those who had endured. Travelers along the roads paused to inhale the scent, a mixture of wood smoke, cooking, and the faint tang of the earth itself, still scarred by ash and neglect. The paths, once empty and overgrown, were now cleared by small groups of survivors, moving with baskets of food or bundles of firewood. The smoke marked their progress, a living map of effort and survival, guiding neighbors and returning merchants alike. Yet even as the roads filled with movement, the remnants of the plague lingered in memory and in caution. People walked slowly, watching shadows, measuring each step, fearful that any misstep might bring illness back into their midst. Alongside the roads, the fields began to show life again. Farmers who had survived returned to till soil that had lain untended for months, building small fires at the edges of their plots to ward off frost or to sterilize the ground. Smoke curled into the morning air, twisting around the young shoots of grain and vegetables, carrying with it a faint reassurance that life, fragile as it was, could resume. Villagers emerging from shuttered homes stopped to greet one another, keeping distance yet nodding toward the rising smoke, as though it were a communal signal. We are still here. Even the forests were no longer silent. Fires burned in controlled clearings, clearing underbrush that had grown wild, protecting both villages and fields. Smoke drifted through the trees, a low haze that blurred the sun and created a strange, dreamlike quality to the landscape. Wolves and birds returned gradually, cautiously, sensing that the land was being reclaimed by the rhythm of human hands. Paths once dangerous in isolation became familiar again, marked by the gentle columns of smoke rising into the sky. By midday, the roads were lined with signs of life. Children ran alongside adults carrying water, chickens pecked at the edges of cleared paths, and neighbors exchanged bread and herbs over small fences. Fires from the kitchens and hearths painted the town in shifting golds and reds, the smoke above bending in the breeze. The scent reminded everyone that survival required effort, but also that warmth, nourishment, and care could still exist, even in a world forever altered. As dusk fell, the smoke turned golden, drifting into the valleys and across the fields. Travelers returned home, following its winding path like a guide through a changed landscape. The roads of smoke, once a symbol of destruction, had become a symbol of endurance, a living thread linking the scattered survivors, the fields they tended, and the homes they had rebuilt. And in the quiet of the night, when the wind carried the faint scent of wood and ash into every street and alley, the people understood that the plague had not erased them entirely. The roads of smoke were proof. The living still moved, still labored, and still claimed the world as theirs. Step by careful step, breath by careful breath. Morning came differently after the plague. The sun rose over a world softened by smoke and ash, its light pale and filtered, as if the earth itself had grown cautious. Streets that had once been familiar appeared strange beneath the haze. Roofs were scarred by fire, walls were blackened, fences lay broken and rotting. The smell of ash lingered everywhere, in the alleys, the wells, the markets, a constant reminder of what had passed. Yet the dawn was a signal, subtle but insistent, that life persisted despite everything. The survivors emerged slowly. Mothers carried children, still thin from months of hunger, their arms weak but determined. Fathers guided livestock that had survived, coaxing cows and goats from abandoned barns. Merchants, some of whom had fled the cities and returned weeks later, began to open stalls again. Bread, herbs, and tools were arranged carefully, as if the very act of placing them in sunlight could restore order to a fractured world. Every movement was measured, cautious, and deliberate. The smell of ash hung in the air, but it was not solely the scent of death. Fires rekindled in hearths, in ovens, in small piles of wood stacked beside homes, sent up smoke that intertwined with the remnants of the burned city. It was a smell that carried both warning and reassurance, a reminder of what had been lost and what could still be saved. Smoke curled over rooftops like fingers of memory, touching every street, every wall, every surviving soul with the faint weight of the past. Children ran through the streets for the first time in months, their laughter quiet but resolute. They played among ruins, hopping over fallen beams, weaving between the scattered ash, their voices rising like small promises. Their feet traced patterns across streets once silent, their movements marking the city as reclaimed, if only temporarily. Adults watched from doors and windows, nodding in cautious approval, keeping watch for danger, yet allowing the first traces of joy to return. The church bells, long silent, tolled once more. Their sound, rolling across rooftops and over the hills, reminded the survivors of time's passage and of a world still governed by rhythm. The priests, emerging from months of seclusion, spoke prayers aloud, their voices trembling but steady. Candles were relit, incense burned, and the faithful knelt again, not only in mourning, but in cautious gratitude. For the first time in months, the city felt stitched together by something larger than survival, by memory, by ritual, and by the fragile heartbeat of collective life. By midday, the ash began to settle. Winds carried it to the edges of town, where fields were cleared and tended again. Farmers worked with renewed determination, their hands blistered, their backs stiff, but their eyes set on the small green shoots that promised renewal. Smoke rose from ovens and fires, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the river and the earth. It was the smell of a world slowly learning to breathe, a scent of beginnings after months of endings. When night fell, the survivors gathered in small groups, sharing bread, stories, and warmth by firelight. The ash still clung to their clothing and hair, a reminder of the lives lost, but it no longer defined them. The new dawn had arrived, and though the world smelled of ash, it also smelled of life reclaimed, fragile and tentative, ready to grow again from the ruins. The city had survived. Fires burned steadily in hearths, bells tolled once more, and the survivors moved cautiously through streets no longer empty. Yet even in the return of light and labor, There was a silence that lingered, a weight that pressed against every doorway, every alley, every stone of the city. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of certainty. The world had ended once, and though life persisted, it carried the memory of collapse in every heartbeat. In the early mornings, the streets lay quiet, filled only with the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional cry of a bird daring to return. Survivors moved slowly, wary of the spaces where the sick had fallen, where carts had rolled the dead to the pits. The ash still clung to rooftops, the blackened wood of doors and fences reminded everyone of what had been destroyed, and the faint odor of smoke and decay remained in the air. Even those who had survived could not shake the memory of emptiness that had once consumed the city. Families gathered cautiously, whispering to one another in low voices. Mothers held children close, fathers brushed soot from walls and floors, and neighbors nodded in silent acknowledgement of shared loss. Conversation was sparse, and laughter cautious. The city had learned that even the smallest noise might carry danger, and the habit of silence had settled deep into the bones of the living. Even the streets themselves seemed to remember, echoing footsteps differently now, carrying sound without reply, as if the world itself had grown reserved. The survivors tried to rebuild, but every act of construction was tinged with memory. Houses were repaired, fences mended, gardens replanted, but always with the awareness of what could be lost again. Merchants reopened their shops, cautiously displaying bread, grain, and herbs. Yet each transaction was shadowed by the knowledge of months when the marketplace had been deserted, when the black flags had flown and carts had passed with the dead. The city's rhythm had returned, but the pulse was measured, slow, wary. Children learned to live in a world that had ended and begun again without them. They explored the streets, the fields, and the riverbanks, discovering remnants of homes, toys, and objects left behind by those who had vanished. They played quietly, carefully, always aware of absence. The stories they told each other were woven from memory and imagination, tales of neighbors who had disappeared, of the carts that rolled through the streets, of the black flags marking the doomed. These narratives became their own history, shaping their understanding of survival in a city that had learned to fear sound, touch, and even sight. Even at night, when the lamps were lit and fires burned in every hearth, the silence pressed against the city. The bells, though ringing, carried a hollow echo over rooftops. The wind whispered through empty chimneys, shadows stretched across the streets like reminders. And in that silence, the living listened, remembering, mourning, and yet learning to endure. The world after the plague was not the world before it. The streets were alive, but memory lingered in every corner. The city had learned that life could return, but it would always carry the mark of what had been lost. And in the quiet that followed the end of the world, those who remained understood. Survival was not simply living, it was remembering, rebuilding, and listening to the silence that spoke louder than any bell, louder than any cry, louder than the world had ever been before.